Welcome everyone to this episode of Kynotalk by Kynotech. It's episode uh, 94 already.
Huh?
So I'm very happy to let everyone know who's listening. So those who are watching already see it. But this time I have Dr. Nathan Hall or Nathaniel Hall. You choose how I should call you. Um, on air today, and I'm very happy that he has the time to spend a few minutes, maybe an hour or more, to chat with me about detection dog and especially the odor conditioning topic. So thanks for stopping by.
Thank you so much for having me. And you can call me Nathan, Nathaniel, or Dr. Hall, or my I'm in trouble names.
Okay. All right.
So we'll just go with Nathan today.
Perfect. So I will not ask you a lot about your person and your past because for everyone who is interested in that, I think Cameron did a few episodes with you already and also covered some of your background, etc. And I will so everyone who's listening, I really recommend those episodes with Cameron. And I've also googled Nathan, so there are some other let's see, free content episodes on YouTube with different people. So I would really like to take the time today and talk with you about the odor of or the science of odor conditioning, because you do a lot of that for your main profession at the Texas Tech University. Um, so maybe you can introduce to the people what the Texas Tech University is about and what your specific office or lab is doing with dogs.
Yeah, of course. So I've been here almost 9 years. I'd say our lab has really kind of been around for about 7.5 to 8 years. And it started when we got here. So there was no program before I got here. We sort of our department in animal sciences decided that they wanted to have a companion animal program. So they just wanted folks to do some research in companion animals, kind of whatever topic. And they were looking actually originally for a nutritionist. And I somehow convinced them that I was close enough. They told me at one point that they had no other applicants. So I just had to not be terrible. And they hired me. But no, so we started an entire companion animal program here. So we have an undergraduate degree where students go through normal animal science classes. So, introduction to animal science, you learn about the physiology, health, care, maintenance of animals. And then we have a series of companion animal sort of track classes, which include like animal welfare, principles of learning and conditioning, which is one of the classes that I teach, an advanced animal training class where you kind of take that lecture, principles of conditioning, and then you learn how to actually apply that to a dog. And then every Friday you go out and apply that to a dog. Then we have a practicum where basically we use our lab's dogs, and you get assigned one of those dogs as your dog to train for that semester. And most of our students are interested in a lot of basic things. So the dogs learn and go through their sort of obedience types of training programs, cooperative care, other types of muzzle training, all kinds of things that we want to throw at them that semester.
Hey, before you keep watching, everything you see here and much more is also available in our live webinars. If you ever miss one, you can conveniently find the recordings in our web shop. Just go to www.kynotech.at, open the webinar recordings section, and start browsing. And don't forget our special offer. 4 webinars for the price of 3. Get your knowledge delivered straight to your home. And now let's get back to the video.
And then the students will go off and do internships, and then also take tracks in animal shelter management, cat courses. So you can go in a variety of different directions in terms of sort of that program. So that's sort of what our students see. And then I guess probably my 60% or more job is actually focused on research. So I'm a psychologist by background, learning about sort of the experimental analysis of behavior. So kind of behavior analysis with animals. And then I've focused that in terms of how do dogs perceive odor? How do they generalize from one odor to another? How can we enhance generalization from one odor to another? Basically my entire career. So that would be going
Mm-hmm.
back to like 2011, 2012 is when I started in that area.
Wow.
So then our lab, we kind of run a train to adopt program where we have dogs that we either pull from like different federal programs where the dogs are dropouts from those programs.
Mm-hmm.
So some, for example, might be afraid of escalators, no good for that program, but
Mm-hmm.
great for understanding sort of the olfaction and perception of the dog. And
Sure.
then we have our local animal shelter program where we run train to adopt programs with them, where the dogs are typically the longest stay. So the dogs that are typically energetic, have a variety of other things, they go through our training program. And
Mm-hmm.
then we also train them on detection. So we have purely green dogs where we can learn at and test a dog going from no odor training to a specific odor training. How does that influence their generalization, perception, things like
Okay.
that? Um,
Wow.
and then so we're just revolving through dogs coming in, going out for adoption, and then we run all kinds of different experiments on how do we optimize training
Mm-hmm.
for generalization, performance, um, and yeah, you name it. We probably have some type of related study on that topic.
So people who are interested in participating, do they have to be a student at the Texas Tech University, or do you also offer this to dog trainers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have actually. I need to get it back online right now. You don't need to care about this. Our university switched from one learning platform to
Mhm.
another learning platform,
Okay.
so I need to transition it over. So we do have a an online course for that's more geared to professional detection dog trainers.
Mm-hmm.
I actually put all of the lectures for free online on my YouTube account. So if you just want to watch like what would be the lectures, those are free on YouTube. If you want me to give you graded feedback and take quizzes, then you sign up, and I think it's like $100 and something, and then you could go through the same program. Lectures are all the same, but you would get graded quizzes, and then I provide feedback on like training plans that you provide.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one option that we have. Then also for particularly interested folks, we do often host internships where you can come out and just see what we do, then and how we do it, why we do it. You know, how do we present odors? How is that? Why do we do it this way? How do we store things in our bunkers? How do we prevent odor cross contamination? So we offer that up. I'd say that's not like a not many people take us up on our offer to come out to Lubbock, but occasionally folks do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we do offer that way, and then we provide classes whenever we can go to different seminars that are open and available.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably once or twice a year, we'll host seminars that people can bring their dogs, and then we'll do different types of detection challenges and problems from our perspective rather than more of the academic perspective, which a lot of times is more of um, where are different challenges that we might be able to address for detection work. I feel
Okay.
like I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to stop there.
No, it's very interesting. So I'm wondering, so what would you recommend for people coming for an internship to see your work and here and there help out a little? Um, how much time should they think to spend?
I think it depends on what someone would want. If you are just interested in like how do we do it from an academic perspective, kind of like pulling the curtain from behind the scenes of like what does that
Mm-hmm.
actually look like, then that's just a day really. That's just a look at this. If it's something where you want to get involved and see how do we present odors and how do we go through our cleaning cycles, how do we maintain odor integrity, how do we present different odors for the dogs, work dogs in our like olfactometer systems, that's probably more of like a week type of thing. And then if you want to learn like how does the whole researchy kind of enterprise work, then that's probably a couple of, I mean, if you want the whole thing, if you're doing a PhD, that's 5 years. But if you just want to kind of see like what does progress through a project start to look like, then
Mm-hmm.
that's probably more like a semester basis.
Okay.
Um, And then if you want to become a full-fledged researcher, we do that. That's called a PhD, and that's a 5-year program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any prerequisites for an internship?
No, for the most part, reach out to us, and really it's just about time and whether we have the capacity at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But we offer them to kind of all folks that are interested. Our goal is so that, we are a place for people to learn. So we try to be a pretty open book in that respect.
Nice. So last year you've reached out to me because you were doing a survey for I don't know if it was a study or something, but what are you working on right now, actually? So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now we have projects all over the board. So some of them are related to how does exercise or the level of physical activity that the dogs have to engage in during a search task, how does that impact their detection capability or performance? So are their detection capabilities the same at the start of a search task versus the end if the dogs are engaging in substantial exercise during that period? For example, if you have a task where the dog is running or trotting at 5 miles per hour during that entire time, is there a decline in detection? When does it occur? Can we pick up signals that indicate when that occurs? So we've done some recent research where the dogs were doing a detection task while running on a treadmill to try and simulate situations where the dogs are actually actively running and exercising while also being expected to simultaneously do a detection exercise. And we find that if the dog is at a walk or relatively a low before getting into a full kind of trot level, we didn't see any performance decrement across up to about 35-40 minute window. If the dog is at a higher level trot, so this would be about 8 kilometers per hour, it was around 25 minutes we started to see a substantial decline around threshold detection conditions. And what I mean by that is, your ability to detect something is going to be proportional to how strong that signal is, right? So for people who work in narcotics, some narcotics, like you don't need a detection dog to smell. Like you can walk by an apartment, right, and be like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Your dog could be fully gassed out and they'll still be able to smell that in the same way that you could go for a run multiple times around. And as you walk in, you just feel that breathing in. So we're not talking about complete, like loss of detection. We're talking about detection of signals that are much lower, and closer to threshold levels. So if you're in the explosives world, TNT is one of those explosives that, is harder to detect. You typically need a different type of sniffing pattern. You need different type of capabilities for that. So we try to mimic that by taking an odor and bringing it down close to detection threshold levels. At about 25 minutes at detection or close to those threshold levels, we basically got to zero detection. At things that were 10 to 100 fold greater than those threshold levels, dogs were cruising along just fine. So we had a very specific loss that was time dependent, exercise intensity dependent, but also concentration related. They could still hit those high odors, no problem, but it was those low odors that we completely lost detection for, which means that a dog might look like they're just fine if you're using just high odors, when you might be missing something that might be concealed or a different type of explosive that generally is more difficult to detect. But it also depends on how long and the total level of exercise intensity for that.
And also like how important was or is the experience of the dogs? Because I could imagine that like a young dog who is full of juice and just works more with his body rather than with his nose and his head might drop a little sooner than an experienced one.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually one that we're working on right now. I don't have the answers because we're literally working on that right now in that kind of question. So what we were looking at for there was not so much necessarily experience. That'll be interesting. We would need more dogs at different experience levels to
Mhm.
look at that. But what if do some dogs maybe better self-regulate? So in other
Mhm.
words, a dog can detect that, I'm getting a little gas, but instead of just doing full blown run because that's what I'm anticipating, if you allow them to drop down a little bit, will they recover and will they prevent that loss? And I think that that might be something that experienced dogs might be able to do better because perhaps they can drop down into either a gait that requires less energy, or maybe
Mhm.
they can, you know, walk themselves back a little bit so that they can recover detection performance in that. Whereas you might have a dog who's a little ball crazy or a little toy crazy and just go, 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 and, burns themselves out, runs out of
Mhm.
gas. And then that's where we kind of see that effect. So, no, I think that that's a very valid point that we've got to get to. But unfortunately, science is always slower and longer in terms of getting to answers than what people typically want. Because a lot of times people want the answer yesterday,
No, sure.
but it takes a long time to get there. And that's one of the revisions, or I guess follow up studies we're working on.
Mm. That's pretty cool. I would love to get into that topic when you're done with that, maybe in a few weeks or
Sure.
months. That would be really interesting. So let's get into the topic of foundations of odor conditioning. And funny enough, actually, tomorrow I will fly to Germany, to Köln. I don't know how it's pronounced in English. I think Cologne.
Uh huh.
And so there is a 3-day symposium about working dogs, especially for detection and also man trailing, tracking, etc. So all about nose work.
Oh, nice.
So I think, yeah, it's just perfect that we are talking today. So I can act very smart then, gaining a lot of knowledge from you, hopefully. So my first question here is um, concerning the terminology. How do you define odor conditioning? Because like people are talking about scent imprinting, odor imprinting, conditioning, etc. And I have no scientific background, but what I've learned is that if we manage to use a certain terminology, then we're all more likely to understand each other because we're using the same words and with the same meaning. So how can you help me out with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And terminology itself is almost its own branch of science.
Mhm.
Uh, so, like, for example, in the United States, there's a working dogs and sensors committee that is working on sort of defining, at least for the United States, what our terminology will be. And I'm not actually on that group, but I hear that there's pretty heated debates in terms of what different
Yeah.
words mean. There are different kind of perspectives on terminology. Uh, where folks think that there's like one universal standard and then that should be upheld across all groups at all times. I tend to view it more a bit as like languages, in the sense that obviously people who are speaking different languages will struggle to communicate. There will be miscommunications. There will be problems. But people who are within the same group and speaking the same language will be perfectly fine, even though they might use the same word to mean different things in different
Hmm.
areas.
Hmm.
It becomes a problem, like, for example, me being an American saying, I lost my pants or something like that. That would mean something completely different in the UK than it would in the United States.
Okay.
Um, and that doesn't mean that one version of that is wrong and one version of that is correct. They're just sort of different languages. So for me, what I end up finding is that I try to learn different languages and talk to different communities
Hmm.
using their languages instead of forcing everyone to learn my language, which I mean, I guess is more of the American tradition. Uh, but I do try to adapt those languages there. Other people from the scientific community feel the exact opposite, that the scientific
Hmm.
community defines what that language is and that everyone should learn and follow that because that's how the scientific community define that. And I can see those points, but I tend to find that, again, it leads to miscommunication. So I try to rather change my language to fit those different areas.
Okay.
Now, with that said, how do I define odor conditioning, odor imprinting, things like that? Odor imprinting is actually a word that I only use when I am talking to specific communities because, from the scientific perspective, odor imprinting is a complete misnomer. Imprinting is a very specific type of behavioral phenomenon that occurs a lot of times with our avian species, where they see something early in life and then there's a long term sort of preference that is strongly driven to that, and it becomes a strong sort of reward in itself.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's not really it's not at all what we're talking about when we're talking about our detection dogs. Some of them not are being exposed to that odor until they're 1+ years of age, and they're not creating some type of, survival level attachment to that odor in that sense that we kind of refer to those. So in my like typical, I guess, definitions, I don't normally refer to odor imprinting. But then I would talk about odor conditioning, and then I describe it both in sort of a classical conditioning sense, where it becomes a conditioned stimulus, which then sort of elicits a conditioned response. And those are typically going to be, I think, what we often call our like change of behavior types of behaviors. So these are the things that the dog shows, that a conditioned stimulus was presented, they've detected that odor, and then they start engaging in some preparatory behavior related to a reinforcer coming. So for me, that's like that head turn, that head snap, that new body positioning that kind of occurs when they have that. I think, and there's not science behind it, this is my opinion based off of conditioning, that those are all classically conditioned, sort of conditioned responses that come through the conditioning process. Our trained final response is typically things that we shape through operant conditioning. So the odor also becomes what we call a discriminative stimulus. So an odor that indicates if you engage in your trained final response, you'll get that toy or food reinforcer at the end of it. So then I think of conditioning, or what we typically do in detection dog work, is going to be a combination of those. And sometimes I see certain trainers will start with just that classical conditioning. So that might be like the single pot of that odor where the dog just sniffs it and then that reinforcer comes. Sometimes people will start with an operant where I shape a trained final response completely independent of odor whatsoever, and then I try and chain that behavior together. And all of those ways are valid to reaching the end point. And I'm not sure there's really been any science that has looked at, does one way lead to better or worse, or what are the conditions that might be related to enhancing one or the other. Personally, what we use in our lab is that we start with a classical conditioning approach to odor exposure, and you just give food. I'm not looking for a drain final response there, and you're just getting that, and we start building up a conditioned response. And the reason for that is we use a nose hold type behavior a lot of times as our trained final response, where the dogs have to hold their nose in an odor port for 4 seconds. And what we find is that the conditioned response that you get from classical conditioning oftentimes is that nose hold. So it ends up kind of just pushing both a classical conditioning perspective and the operant conditioning perspective in the same direction for us. And then it ends up, there's no conflict. It just works kind of nicely. And that as you're moving forward classically conditioning, the operant conditioning is kind of coming along with it. And then they all just kind of merge together relatively easily. But if I was looking at a different type of trained final response, like a down, I might take a slightly different approach, because then you might end up in a situation where your dog is doing that nice focus alert, and then they don't want to transition to that down as easily. But I think that ends up then depending a bunch on what are your particular, what's that final detection task look like for you, versus what it might look like for me. So I think that there can be benefits with different approaches.
Sure. Have I understood you correctly that you said you want to see 4 seconds of indication behavior?
That's what we
And
typically use. Yeah.
so why is that? Is there a specific yeah, need behind it? Like you need this for your studies, or you say, well, 4 seconds is the perfect middle path?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So 4 seconds is obviously arbitrary, but also somewhat arbitrary, and that there we do have some rationales behind it. So for us, we have our olfactometer system is automatically scoring that time for us. So how long they're doing that nose hold. And when we do generalization studies, so we train you to odor one. So say
Mhm.
for example, C4, an American plastic explosive.
Yeah.
We want to see, will the dog spontaneously respond to a variation of that, maybe C4 from a different manufacturer, or maybe something like PE4, which is a British version of that. Um, how well will they respond to it? We then can use that nose hold time as an easy generalization measure. In other words, does that dog hold for 2 seconds? Do they hold for 3 seconds? If they hold for 4 seconds, then it's complete generalization. They gave you our trained final response at that 4 seconds. But if it's like 2.5 seconds, whereas all other distractors are about a quarter second, which is what we normally see, we can
Hmm.
say that yes, they are detecting that this is related to their target, but they're not giving me the full trained final response.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
allows us to kind of numerically see, do you generalize better to this one or do you generalize better
Hmm.
to that one? So 4 seconds gives us a good window because we know most distractors are about a quarter of a second. So 0.25 seconds. And then our trained final response is 4 seconds. So then we have a good window to look at variations and generalization that way.
Hmm.
We also use 4 seconds because we find that um, if you have, when you're playing sort of the shell game with just a handful of options, sometimes dogs and you give them really hard tasks, they'll default to the easiest option, which is I hold for 4 seconds here, I'll hold for 4 seconds here, I'll hold for 4 seconds here. And 4 seconds tends to prevent that. If you do it for 2 seconds, then
Yeah.
why not just gamble with everything?
Yeah. Yeah.
So 4 seconds tends to reduce that. Um, but other than that, it's relatively arbitrary. We didn't do a study that said 4 seconds is the true, real answer of what you should use. It
Mm.
just happens to be convenient, and we just use it frequently.
So the machine that you're using, and maybe also referring here, is how do you call it, the olfactometer, or what is it called?
Yeah, so we call it the Canine Olfactometer.
Ah,
We
yeah.
need a better name because it's not particularly catchy or cool, but right
Yeah.
now that's what we refer to it.
But so this, because I'm afraid I haven't yet seen a video of how it works, but I think I talked to Cameron about it, and obviously it might be similar to the machine, and we need to have a better name for it, like the detection dog training system, aka the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't know if you have had the chance to watch the YouTube video I sent you a few
Yes, I
weeks
did.
ago.
Mm-hmm.
So because there we were facing similar issues, that we have a presetting, the dog is indicating for 2 seconds or 2 seconds intermittent, and then the machine decides when to reward. So there is like a light bridge, and if the nose is the like between those lights, the
Mm-hmm.
machine understands, okay, the indication is long enough or too short. So this is obviously similar, or am I thinking in a different direction now?
Yeah, no, it's very similar. So in terms of how the dog sort of interface with the device with the light bridge and a certain duration timing, that's very similar. Um, the main sort of differences in terms of the way our system works is that ours are like smaller independent systems. So they would be like different boxes, and then each box all has their own replicate of odors. So instead
Mm,
of like switching things around, each system can present any odor that it wants,
yeah,
and then you just kind of put them out wherever you want them to be. So
yeah.
either on a wall or out in a field or how you want them.
And you even have like multiple different options in each device, right? So you have a blank possibility, a distractor odor, or the real target odor. So that's
Correct.
pretty.
So we typically do about 6 per device.
All
but
right.
they range from 4 to 12.
Mm. That's pretty cool. I wish I could one day visit you to check that out.
Yeah,
That
we have these
seems,
internship things I was just talking about.
yeah, definitely. Definitely. You have to check my calendar. Um, so when talking about the, let's say, odor conditioning,
Mhm.
would you like? I guess that this machine that you have, also the one that we have, um, it's not like all the agencies and all the private companies are using stuff like that. In a dream world, would you think that it would be smart for people to use this for odor conditioning, or is this really just something that you need for research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on what the agency needs are. Um, I mean, I'm slightly biased because we're sort of the, one of the inventors of the
Sure.
olfactometers in some degree. So I guess I caveat any disclosure information, related to that. But I think that it addresses a lot of issues that come up early in training stages. Uh, so it's by far not the problem solver of all things, and just do your training with this machine and then you have an operational dog, right? That's far from the truth. But what we find is that because we bring them out and then bring them to operational teams all the time,
Mm.
it gives you an ability to do odor imprinting, or I just said I don't use that word very often. Odor conditioning. Uh, Odor conditioning in a very clean kind of environment where you are minimizing other potential cues. So, for example, very often you might have if you're doing it in early stage, you need someone switching the boxes around. But
Yeah.
then typically you have a hot target or a hot box. And one thing that we find all the time is that, we think that the dog is paying attention to the odor of that box. But there's 10,000 stimuli that the dog could
Yeah.
be paying attention to. The odor that they just left on the pot, the odor of all of the people touching that one, the
Mhm.
odor of the previous dogs that you used for that particular pot, the odor that you put into the hot pot before that, the
Yeah.
look of the hot pot, the fact that some dogs might have bit that one, so the PVC looks a little different. Maybe it's a slightly different curve. So the dogs could be learning a variety of things completely unrelated to what you want.
Yeah.
If you have a system where like the port and interface that the dog interacts with doesn't change, then you minimize all of those because the odor moves, but the ports, the visual components, the other odor components don't change. So
Mhm.
it gives you an ability to avoid those issues coming up. And then second, the one that we use a lot is that it allows us to go blind, quote unquote, blind very quickly, not knowing where the target odor is.
Yeah.
So typically we have a training plan that I post during different lectures and anyone can sort of watch it. But one thing that you'll see is that we'll do initial sort of odor conditioning, that Pavlovian component ourselves, because you kind of just need quick timing. You need the dog's nose
Mm.
really in there, click treat. You need
Yeah.
that kind of component pretty quick. Once we build the dog up from so that they can hold their nose in for a second, so they just like get their nose in and they just show a little bit of holding their nose in for a second, we then turn it so that our trainers don't know which is the correct port, so that it avoids all of those issues that might come up during that initial helping time, where you might want to like tap on the correct one, or you might want to walk them and slow down when you get to the correct one, or that you might want to have something else to kind of prompt those behaviors. We turn that off right away so that we just
Yeah.
prevent that from ever establishing, and then you don't ever have to fix it later, right? So a lot of times, if you go and you'll see groups that will do all kinds of dances, or will work on having to like, move back and forth and pull the leash this way or tug the leash that way.
Mm.
And we never get to a need for that because the dog never has the opportunity to learn any of those associated cues, so that it's just not ever a relevant thing. So then it
Yeah.
helps that initial odor conditioning move in kind of a clean way. And then the other is just time. So if you load the setup with like 12 different odors, and it allows us to we recently published a study on improving generalization using
Mm.
kind of this intermixed training method, which means that a lot of times sorry, stop me if I'm just going off the deep end
No,
here,
it's
but where
good.
essentially a lot of times we train our dogs, if you've got, say, a set of 8 different odors you want to train your dogs to,
Yeah.
do you train them on one and then wait until they show, excellent performance across the board on that one, and then introduce the next one, and then reach them up until excellent performance there, and then the next one,
Mm-hmm.
which we call sort of sequential training. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's obviously sort of the stew method where people just mix everything together.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also what we call the intermixed method, which is something that is easy to do with, a device that allows you to do lots of different odors, is that you could just load it with 8 different odors, and then every trial is a different odor, so that the dogs are learning from the get-go that I have this diverse range of odors that I need to be trained to, and not just focused on one and kind of create this almost expectation, if you will, that this is the odor that I'm being trained with.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found there is that the intermixed training led to much better generalization to different odor variations than did that sequential method. The mixture method didn't really facilitate anything. It was about the same as the sequential. So
Really?
that
So I was wondering that we always say cocktail conditioning,
cocktail, yeah.
but I like stew. So we were thinking that sometimes dogs might just miss specific odors that are just overshadowed by
Yeah.
other more obvious ones. So I thought that I wouldn't dare to risk my dog not learning like a specific odor by doing the cocktail method, the cocktail way. So that's why we used to do like a single odor
Mm-hmm.
conditioning, and now like with the machine, for example, it's easy to set up 7 different odors and
Yep.
7 different distractor odors, and then just let the dog run through it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, exactly. And that's the intermixed training.
is the overshadowing a problem, or is it like a human imagination?
So in that study, we were focused on explosives, and our cocktail, we did 2 different experiments, but the cocktail with different explosives included C4, so a US-based plastic explosive, ammonium nitrate, which is a typical kind of fertilizer type uh, oxidizer used in fuel oxidizer mixtures, det cord. So I don't know if you guys use the same words or not, but typical uh, uh, what you would use to detonate a potential explosive with. So
Yeah.
then TNT. And so we mix the odor headspace of all of those together, train the dog to that until they were 90+% accurate, so close to about 100% detection capability.
Mm-hmm.
And then we tested their ability, like how long would they hold their nose and how many of them would respond to C4 specifically, to det cord specifically, to ammonium nitrate specifically, and to TNT. And what we found is that dogs overall responded to the C4 75% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
They responded to the det cord around 40% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
They responded to ammonium nitrate 12% of the time. And we didn't have a single alert to TNT. So basically the answer is yes. We saw very strong overshadowing for C4, but the det cord kind of interacted with it. So some dogs kind of responded to the det cord, some responded to the C4, or some responded to the C4, but were like, that's not quite the same C4 because I also smelled other things in there. So that's why the dogs were at 100% to the mixture, but only 75% to C4, and then only around 50 or 40% to det cord. So most of the dogs did not find any of the individual components to fully represent what they were trained to. But nonetheless, if they were going to choose one, they chose C4, and nobody responded to TNT.
Mm-hmm. So, and talking about that, the next thing is actually that we already train with a sort of a cocktail, because you're talking about the C4 and the TNT, etc. So this is already a mix of different substances, and there is also the approach to do the conditioning, like with the with the single components versus the ready-made explosives or products, where whatever it is, it might be narcotics, it might be mold or explosives. So would you suggest to rather go for the real product that the dog might face outside, or go for like the sterile lab
Yeah,
single component method?
that's a good question. And the answer is it somewhat depends. Sometimes both is the answer, sometimes
Yeah.
one is the answer. And the reason for that is that what the dogs are actually picking up on for some targets is sometimes the actual, like, true material. So, for example, some explosives, like TATP, for example, that one is actually relatively volatile and produces itself a relatively strong odor. Now, for example, C4, which is primarily RDX, is the primary energetic in that produces almost no odor. So that if you train the dogs purely to RDX, they won't respond to C4. But if you train them to C4, they'll respond to C4, and they probably won't respond to RDX. But sometimes you need the dogs to find RDX, so you need to train to that pure, right? Because someone might actually synthesize or create RDX, and you need to train to C4 because C4 might be something that they have acquired through some means and have actually trained. So in that case, you actually need to train to both because both are separate threats, and just training to one pure sterile, this is the energetic, you don't a lot of times get that spontaneous generalization to all of those other components, or when you have that sort of real world picture. So it depends on what your threat is going to be. Because sometimes, when it comes to narcotics, maybe we think of this as what we want as the pure, pure, pure. And a lot of times what we measure as purity is not necessarily odor purity. So, for example, something can be 99% ingredient X, but its odor is actually completely misrepresented by that. Because if we have something with a very low vapor pressure, so cocaine, for example, cocaine has a very, very low vapor pressure. If you have something that is pharmaceutical grade and is just pure, pure, pure cocaine, that's 99.999% something, and it doesn't have any other components, that smells completely different than 99% pure cocaine with a 0.01% additive to it. Because what that smells like is just the additive. Even though that additive might only be 0.0001%, that actual cocaine sample smells like that. And most of the illicit narcotics that you're going to get on the street are not because people have paid for, tens of thousands of dollars from a pharmacist with their DEA license or their drug enforcement license. It's going to be coming from, cartels or some other things. And even though those might be very, very pure, they're often not made in using the same pharmaceutical processes. So they will contain 0.01% of something, 0.1% of that, 0.01%. So that means that illicit or street narcotics can smell completely different than other types of narcotics, even based off of, 50% purity versus 90% purity might actually smell the same. And what's different is going to be that pharmacy grade is completely different. And then training the dog to that pharmacy grade, they may not even recognize the illicit or street kind. So the answer is it depends. And it depends on the target and the situation, which is not a very clear or a nice answer, but is the real answer.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah. So that might be a little off topic, but a friend told me a few days ago, I think, that he heard an interview about some of the real big Hall of Famer rock bands, and people were wondering how they got so old, and they said, well, they just used the purest cocaine back then, so wasn't that toxic. But they wouldn't suggest to do it nowadays, because nowadays in the purest cocaine there might be so many herbicides and toxins that that it's not healthy either way. But so that's actually the interesting thing. Now I was thinking that maybe in the purest cocaine you might find so many herbicides or other toxins that maybe you could even train your dogs to dose. I don't know. That was just a
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about some of those, but definitely uh, because a lot of it is going to go through a type of synthesis route and also a degradation route, and then there's also like in sort of the actual processing part, there's a cleaning phase.
yeah.
So it depends on like how
Okay.
you know how much are your cartels cleaning and doing those final processes and things like that, and oftentimes not as much, and definitely not to the same degree that
Yeah.
your big pharmaceutical companies are that have
Probably.
certification standards and things like that. So,
Probably. Yeah.
but yeah, so it means that the smell can be completely different.
Yeah. So Nathan, years ago, I was listening to one of Cameron's podcasts with you. I think it was Cameron's podcast. And either way, you have brought up this very simple but powerful example of when you mix like what's the English term? Synthetic flavors. Let's say strawberry and I can't recall banana or pineapple, and you put it together.
Caramel.
Then
Yeah.
yeah.
Strawberry and
So
caramel together. So if you take a chemical that smells like strawberry, a chemical that smells like caramel, mix
yeah,
them together, and it produces a synthetic sort of third smell, which is pineapple,
yeah,
uh,
right,
which is something that you wouldn't necessarily predict.
yeah.
Um, I also use other examples. So, like for example, cola. The smell of cola is
Mhm.
also a synthesis of citrus, vanilla, cinnamon, and a couple of other ingredients. There's actual
Mhm.
true cola plants, but a lot of it is actually
Yeah,
a synthetic mixture of different things that you wouldn't think about. So, like vanilla Coke is actually vanilla has always been a part of the cola
Mhm.
flavor. We just never
Mhm.
realized it before. But that's also a synthetic one. But there's a lot of examples that produce these synthetic kind of
Yeah,
scents that are separate from any of those individual components.
yeah,
Um, and then I also use a lot of times that uh, the way you perceive an odor, particularly when it comes to generalization, is also going to be dependent on your experience with it and what other things something has been associated with it. I don't know how much of this is an American or my experience, but if you go to like different candle stores or like perfume stores,
Mhm.
a lot of times you'll smell certain things that smell sweet. You're like, "Ooh, this smells like there might be a cookie candle," and you're like, "Whoa,
Mhm.
this smells
Mhm.
way too sweet."
Mhm.
Uh, and the funny thing is that sugar doesn't smell, right? The
Yeah,
only when you smell sugar and you open up sugar, it doesn't smell sweet by itself. The
no,
only
that's
sugar, the only kind of sweet things are byproducts that come from the manufacturing process of
mhm.
regular
Mhm.
sugar. But the reason why we smell certain things as sweet is because we associate sweet with vanilla. We
Mhm.
associate sweet with other particular volatile chemicals. So that when we
Mhm.
smell those, we think, that smells like sugar, even though
Yes.
sugar is not an involved component of that.
Mhm.
And so the reason why I say that is a lot of times people will have like their training aids always wrapped in a particular material. So
Yeah,
sometimes I've seen, like, for example, I put my training aids in a canvas bag, and then I just use my training aids all in canvas bags. And then eventually, a good test that we always play around with and can make people mad is put those same bags out and hide them underneath the steer wheel or hide them underneath something like that, and you get very strong responses.
yeah,
And not because they were contaminated, they could be completely separate, but because that becomes associated as smelling like your target because it's always been associated with that and never really separated out. And then it becomes a very, very difficult extinction process to then try and extinguish those things that get associated with that target smell. You can prevent that from the get-go, by obviously using that odor. Well, one, whatever you're using as your containment material, pick it to be something that's as low odor as possible. But then
mhm.
second, you should always have 2, 3, 4 times the number of negative controls that are of that container
Okay.
material as you do as a target. Not just
Yeah,
one. It needs to
yeah,
be something that is greater than, so that the animal can't really use that. Because if it's just
yeah,
one, then the animal can be like, Yeah, well, 50% of the time it's associated with it, 50% of the time it's not associated with it. So then
Interesting.
overall, it's like flipping a coin as to whether they
Yeah.
will view it as being
Yeah.
associated with that target or not. But if you use it so that there's like 5 or 6 times the amount of that as a negative versus your target, then that won't get associated with it as well because it's more often associated as a negative than it is with positive.
That's very interesting. So on the one hand, what we've learned from this obviously is that we should not only use like different components and finished products, but also we should train them with different seals or packed in different materials.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, we and like I think most people would think of this. Still, most people are too lazy to put that much effort into odor conditioning, unfortunately. But what we have realized, and we had to, in German we say we have to pull our own nose to correct ourselves. So we have started to run theme days or topic related days where we go to the supermarket and just buy a variety of different herbs or
Mm-hmm.
different candy and different chips or whatever you want, and to try out different odor distractors.
Mm-hmm.
So because we most of the time we just run the same distractor odors, but
Mm-hmm.
from what you have said, actually we should even not only double it, we should have it 3 to 4 times more of variety.
And especially anything that might overlap with relationship to your target that's not a target. So
Mm.
like similar type of packing materials, similar type of containment materials. And yeah, one of the things that is far from obvious is that a lot of times we think of distractors as like a back end or just to demonstrate that the dog is okay. But
Mm.
distractors are actually very useful training tools themselves because
Yeah.
it helps narrow what it is that you want the dogs to find, or it can be used to help kind of push, where you want the dog's generalization or discrimination to go. So if you want to make sure that packing materials is not something that they might pick up on, while you're putting out a variety of different packing materials, those also need to become distractors as well. And things that might overlap of similar headspaces or headspace materials. So plastic explosives, for example, overlap with plastics. So
Mm.
if that's what you're using and you want to make sure that you don't have any incidental false alarms to plastics, then having as many different variety of plastic materials, you know, are going to be important for making sure
Mm.
that you have the dog focused on that, the plastic smells that are specific to those kinds of explosives. So I think distractors are just as valuable as training tools as the target
Mm.
odor itself. And a lot of
Yeah.
times we don't think about that.
Yeah. And another important note, because we still see it here and there, and it's mind blowing. Guys, don't put the distractor odors and the target odors in the same case. This really makes no sense when hiding it, because people are still wondering sometimes. Oh, why is my dog indicating on the gloves that we've used as a distractor? Maybe because they have stored it with their real target odors for like weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So this might be a good hint. Uh, Going on with some of my questions, because I think otherwise I will lose grip of of what I've prepared. Is there a chance to say like an average, or yeah, what's the average amount of repetitions we should get on a dog on a specific odor to be able to say, well, now he should be good with it? Like, how many times should they indicate or not indicate and associate the odor with reward, um, to test them if they might indicate it later
Yeah,
on?
that's a good question. I think it's a loaded question too. I'd say there's two caveats to that. So for us, we typically have a statistical criterion. So before we say that a dog has met a particular type of criterion, we need to create a test and typically our minimum test is going to be 10 trials, but we typically go for 20 trials, and the dogs need to alert to that at least 9 to 10 out of 10 times. And then once the dog has reached that, we would say that they have reached that criterion on that. Then there's the question of criterion to that odor or criterion to that sort of category of odor. So, for example, we might train a dog to a particular odor that you might have, like a version of an explosive that you might have, but you might go down to another law enforcement agency and that same type of explosive smells a little bit different and they may not respond to that. Yeah. So I think instead of a lot of times focusing on repetition of a specific material that you have, which if we do that forever, so like if you have a dog, and we find this over about a 2-month process, if you take a particular material that is just yours and you focus on a lot of repetition of that specific material, you'll move that generalization gradient to be so focused to that specific material that they may not find that same type of category material. So say it's C4, just as an example. They may not find C4 from another agency just down the road because they've become so particular to your version of C4 that's obviously going to pick up environmental contaminants. It's going to depend on how you store it. So you want to have lots of repetition, but lots of variation of that repetition. So lots of variation of that C4. And I think that's what's more important than singular repetition of a singular odor example.
But in variation of the C4 in this example, is it like the specific C4 from this agency in, like you have the source of the C4 and you now use different quantities, or you use different C4s from different producers?
Both, all. So we've actually, so that overgeneralization factor, we've actually found, and we run through a lot of trials because we're collecting data. So we run, dogs 20, 40 trials a day, but we found over a couple month process, we could take C4, so one set of C4, partition it, one set goes into the bunker. So it's it goes into a glass vial, it's sealed with a Teflon septic cap, parafilmed around it, goes into a Mylar heat sealed bag, into another Mylar heat sealed bag, so that we know that, it's not getting contaminated in that sense. And then we have another sample that we use on a daily basis, and we train the dogs to that. And over 2 months, what we'll find is that it was the exact same sample that we pulled. We just partitioned it at the beginning. That if you then test the dog's generalization back to that sample that's been stored in that bunker all that time, they'll show about a 20 or 30% response rate to it. They'll be like, this is similar, but it's not quite the same. So you can even get generalization. So if you're focusing on a lot of reps of just that one material, just using it over and over and over again makes it different enough from that original material that you may not even get great generalization between the two of them. So I think different levels, different manufacturers, different agencies, but even like creating different partitions of your own material and rotating through those could even be beneficial. Maybe if you want to higher, you combine all of your materials together. If you want to lower it, you have different subsets. So anywhere where you can think of where there might be variations. And I'll tell you, we did not do that as an experiment because we thought that would happen. It just worked out that was part of our protocols, right? That we always just do different sense checks, and we failed that sense check. And we're like, what is going on? How is this happening? And the only explanation was that because our materials, the way that we present them, the dogs can't interact with them. We have a system that prevents the material and the dog from interacting, so they can't contaminate it. It stays in a clean, isolated vial. The only thing is that it just gets used over and over, so it's off-gassing at a different rate versus the one that's sitting sealed nicely in Mylar bags, so that difference of smell alone of used versus not used can produce differences. So that's why I say lots, reps, but reps of variation, not always necessarily the same thing.
So at least here in Europe, and especially in the German-speaking countries, but also, in other countries, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, etc., many times the handlers have like 1 or different little suitcases, like hard shell cases with their samples inside, and really depending on the agency, depending on or the company, they have like 5 gram to 20 gram samples. And like if the dogs are getting used to these samples too much, they get specialists for these ones, but
Yep.
they didn't have a chance to indicate on other samples. Um, my question now is from when does it make sense to try to use different amounts talking about the sample? So does it make sense to try to generalize with a 5 gram, then 20 gram, then maybe 100 gram? Or doesn't even that matter? Should we go like for 5 gram and then 500 gram and then 2 kilos? Like what are the gaps, and when does it make sense to add a different size, weight, amount, etc.? Because I think there was a study that dogs are able to generalize like the 10 times bigger amount of something. But I don't know if you can put that on everything.
Yeah. So that was our study, and no, that we can't generalize that to all different kinds of odors. That was a very specific odor, and that one wasn't even an explosive. So
Okay. It depends.
10x, yeah, it depends. So 10x, and the way that odor generalization works for some odors versus others is interesting, because there are some odors where you change the concentration and it smells almost the same. So, like the rotten egg smell, if you smell rotten eggs, whether it's a ton of rotten eggs or little rotten eggs, they all smell terrible and it all smells really strong. And that one all smells basically the same across a wide range of concentrations.
Yeah.
There's another molecule called indole that at low concentrations, it smells like flowers. At high concentrations, it smells like feces. They're two completely different smells, and they seem unrelated, and they smell just as different as completely different chemicals. And we know that for humans, there's a lot of molecules that if you do change concentration by 10 to 100 fold, they will smell as different as if they were different odors in general. So, what that factor or what that fold change is that's important to train across is, again, going to depend on your odor. And there's not necessarily a universal, which means that to be best prepared, you train as much as you can. So whatever is available and accessible, you do it. Now, to get back to the other question is that odor concentration is not necessarily correlative with weight. So what's going to drive that is going to be surface area of your material. So you can do, so say, for example, you're in an agency that can only have 20 grams. You can manipulate that 20 grams in different ways so that it either smells like 0.1 grams by enclosing it into a bag that only lets off a little bit of gas, or putting it into something that has a big restriction. Or you could spread it out so that it has a really big surface area and give a really long set time, and you can make that smell much stronger. In the same way of, like, for example, I like to use vinegar as an example. So, vinegar you can get as a jug, right? You could take vinegar and put it in a bottle that just has a straw. So the straw is the only way that vinegar can come out. You walk into that room, you're not really going to smell it at all, right? It's just going to be sitting there and there's going to be a straw. Maybe when you get close to it or you sniff around the straw, you'll smell the vinegar. But if you have a kid like mine, say, for example, he knocks it on the floor and the vinegar spreads out everywhere. You walk into that room, you will be immediately hit with a large vinegar smell. You had the exact same quantity. You could say the exact same 10 mils, but it's a very different smell between whether it's restriction in it versus it being spread out along the floor. So you can manipulate your odor, even if you're limited by weight, in those kind of ways to potentially produce different things. And also, like, if your house was warm and was heated up and was, there was sun coming through, you might open that door and just be smacked with that vinegar smell. So there are different things that you can do there. But yeah, ultimately the answer is you've got to train across as many of those variations as you have able to, because we did a study where this actually happened in the real world, where an agency was only able to train with 20 grams of AMFO, and their dogs were deployed to sniff a suspicious bag, and two dogs cleared that bag, indicating that it was safe. It was safe and didn't have any explosive in it. And then they opened it up, and it had 13 kilograms of
Yeah.
ANFO in it.
Yeah. That is pretty.
Luckily, luckily there was it wasn't detonated, or not quite detonable at that time, but still something that made heads turn a little bit. And we did a series of tests to figure out, why did the dogs not respond? Is it because they never trained with a single bag as a search task? Is it because that material of ANFO was different, because different people can make different fuel oxidizer mixtures? Or was it mostly because of the difference between the amount that they train with and the amount that was observed that day? And the answer through that series of experiments was, it was actually the amount that was the main driving factor. You could take a subsample of that material down to 20 grams, and the dogs would alert to that, but they would not alert to the 13 kilograms of that same material.
So that's a big issue, I think, in the detection dog world, because, well, also depending on the branch that you're working your dog in, you get different feedback. So if you have a narcotics dog, the chance you find something is obviously higher than doing explosives. Well,
Yep.
at least depending on where you operate on this planet. But so narcotic dog handlers might get more feedback, and their dogs have a different learning in operational work.
Yes.
So they realize, okay, my dog is able to train with these many grams of something, but you could find it in the operation, like kilos of it. And talking about ANFO, this triggered me. So please don't charge me on that. But there was this terror act I think in Sweden years ago, where this right-wing guy was shooting, or had this massacre on an island with school children, etc. And he had, I think, more than 400 kilos of ANFO in his car.
Jeez.
And I think, like, people working their dogs on explosive really should think of these possibilities, because obviously it wasn't a big deal to get hundreds of kilos of ANFO,
right,
or other things. And often we're just training with these little amounts, so the amount has an impact, obviously, and we should really try to get our hands on big amount training days.
Yeah. No, exactly. And what a lot of times they do here is, they can be organized by some central group or agency, and just getting exposure, is something. And also seeing what your dog looks like in those situations can also be helpful, and that can make a potentially big difference. There's not really any research on, like, how often do you have to have these big days.
Yeah.
But most definitely, having one is greater than having zero. So if it's possible to just figure it out one way or another, even if it's just a day, getting those kinds of exposures can be really, really important.
And actually, this already answers one of my other questions, and that is the question about calibration training, or I don't know how you would call it, but like, we're thinking of, ideally, we have a monthly, like, the dog gets conditioned not only once, because we learned that we should use different amounts and different origins of the samples that we use. So there isn't really one week of conditioning all the odors. But what we try to do is to get the dogs to our place, to calibrate them on what they should really know, at least once a month or something. So, like the bed bugs detection dogs, for example, they, of course, in the deployment, they often find the mix or the cocktail of dead ones, then the shells that they have piled off, all the bed bug feces, and the live ones that we're going for. So we want to calibrate them again and again to only look out for the live ones. do you talk about calibration training, or do you just summarize it all together with odor conditioning?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the most part, I don't talk about it that much because, to be honest, I don't see that very often in terms
Mhm.
of like, there's obviously maintenance training that's done,
Mhm.
but I don't really see it so much as in let's, refocus on the basic odors and use this as a time to maybe proof off of these distractors that the dog's found in the field versus these kinds of things. So no, I honestly I don't think I see that very often. So we don't really typically talk about that. Then when we're running studies in our lab, kind of everything is kind of like calibration training,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of what we're doing.
Please.
We have less of
Maybe.
that operational side, but no, that's a really good point, and I think that would be an interesting, study question. Like, what impacts does that have? What, you know, does it prevent specific operational issues?
Mhm.
Does it maybe give you the opportunity to do generalization training or help maintain those kinds of things? Um, so yeah, no, I
And I
think
think, like, especially in a branch where you might not always have this direct feedback. So,
yeah.
and like Cameron was here 2 years ago, and we hosted a workshop with him and Natalie. And what we were doing back then was like, or our attitude was, don't really reward in operations. Okay, so
Mhm.
early on, we were proud because we had a very reinforcement schedule, and we could operate our dogs without um, rewards and without losing motivation, etc. Because we just built them up like this, and they were used to it. But then
Mhm.
Cameron claimed, and he's 100% right. Well, why would you go operational with your dog if you don't dare to reward? So actually, you're doubting your own process of training. Because like if I run a training in a double
Mhm.
blind and I have, I don't know, 9 hits of 12, still
Mhm.
might be quite good. So why wouldn't I reward my dog in an operational work? So if you, and he's right, I think so. Back then that was a big learning. Now we have, I don't know, you have dogs looking for specific snakes or field hamsters or I don't know, frogs, and people who are looking for that don't have the direct feedback. So the dogs are indicating maybe on a nest of a snake,
Mhm.
and then they have to send it to the lab to prove them, well, a snake
Right.
has really been there. And that's actually, those are the branches where we think we should really get the dogs back to a calibration, just to
Mhm.
ensure them that they shouldn't go out there just indicate, because 50% of the times they get rewarded, 50% of the times they're not getting rewarded, and then they're doing the same that you have explained before with the 2 seconds versus 4 seconds of
Mhm.
indication, um, where it's getting too expensive to have this trial and error thing, or just
Yep.
being rewarded by chance. So maybe that's where this thought came from, running calibrations, depending on the branch you're in.
And I think, running those could also have other potential benefits because, like, when we do seminars, for example, I feel like part of our goal or responsibility is to challenge teams with things that they may not have thought about.
Mm.
Like whether this was a particular distractor or a challenge like, what if there isn't a target within 15 minutes? How long will your dog,
Yeah.
keep searching in those kinds of areas? Or what if we take an odor and we conceal it in such a way that it might be low? Like how do you address those? That could also be something where calibration training could be great, where you could test, confirm generalization to different things, high versus low odor. You can, do a lot of those tests relatively quick to confirm, things where either the dogs might have gone off in operations because of that,
Mhm.
but also gives you good evidence of where they currently sit and where things need to work on.
When, at what point would you recommend starting introducing your team to a variable reinforcement schedule in detection work?
Good question. Um, So I think it depends on, and exactly what we're talking about with variable reward schedules, or you know intermittent schedules of reinforcement. Um, because so I like to break it down that search behavior is it's a chain behavior of two separate behaviors. There is the searching and finding,
Mm.
and then there's the train final response and terminal reinforcer.
That's interesting because, if I may interrupt you,
Mm-hmm.
like we're a Kynotalk company, we've always talked about the key behaviors of different branches, and detection work obviously has two key behaviors, which is the train final response and the search.
Yes.
And like finding is like a moment in between, but you add the moment of finding to the search.
Well,
So
so I think, yeah, so I think the way that I can show it is that they're two separate, they're two behaviors that are linked together, and the find is what links them together.
yeah,
So
exactly.
the find rewards the first part,
Mhm.
and then it also triggers the train final response to the
Yeah.
alert to get them.
Yeah.
And I think that I like to think of them as two separate schedules of reinforcement. So one is how much search do I have to do to get to a find?
Mhm.
And then if I do find something, do I actually get my terminal reinforcer?
Mhm.
And I think that those two schedules operate differently. So this one is something where we might always in training run where the dog always finds something within 10 minutes, or always find something if they search a room, or 90% of the rooms that they search, they find something in. And then they go operational, and you get extinction of this part because they were searching and they're like, I didn't find something in this room. Clearly things have changed. I'm under extinction now, and you're not going
Yeah.
to give me a reinforcer. And then they very quickly separate an operational condition versus a training condition, because they're grossly different in the amount of search that they have to engage in to get to that find.
Yeah.
So I think of, when a lot of times I'm talking about intermittent schedules of reinforcement, I tend to focus on this part because this is the one that I see a lot being potentially an issue, because we don't spend enough time manipulating what that search to find ratio is, so that it matches close enough to what an operational task would look like.
Yeah.
And then there's the second one, which is, if I make a find, do I get that terminal reinforcer? And I think that that link is important, because if this one is really, really low, and then you try and lower this one, you're going to have problems, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
but if this one is 100% and you go operational and you never reinforce operational finds, then you get the exact same issue where the dogs learn that why bother? Because if I do all the work, I get to the find, and then I'm not going to get reinforced in this environment, then why bother, kind of even searching? So I
Yeah.
think both are important. But to answer your question, when do we introduce them? We introduce them right after we achieve our performance metrics after acquisition. Um, and so we bring the dogs up. We reach a 90% criterion on that target odor, and then we first introduce the intermittency on this part, where now we add in blank trials, where the dogs have to be able to search, and we increase the number of blank trials slowly, so the dogs have to increase the amount of search to find it. And then after we do that, we then add an intermittency on this back end if we need it for a study. So say, for example, we don't want to reinforce all of those responses,
Yeah.
then we'll introduce that variable schedule to maintain behavior when we don't reinforce that in the future.
Yeah. I have two questions there, and I hope I can bring them up in English words. The one thing is, does it make sense from your point of view to like teach the technique and teach the dog the expectancy or the possibility that there might not be a find by letting them search also for different things rather than just doing detection with a find, like a search train find response, versus letting them search for toys and sometimes not hiding any, just to make them search like for 10, 20, 30 minutes, because they're doing like they're still searching, but well, at least they're not searching for their explosives or something. Like for sure, they're cued with a different stimulus. For
Mm-hmm.
this task, they know that they're not searching for explosives, but at this one day, they also search for explosives and not finding at the expected point of time. But they might think, well, I know I've experienced a similar situation back then when I was searching for my toy. I also expected to find something, but just didn't find it. I might just keep going. Maybe I will find it later on. I know that's quite complicated.
Yeah.
um, does it make
I think
sense to make them to give them blank searches in the toy search, for example? And can they relate to this blank search in detection? Maybe that's how to put it easier.
yeah. Okay. So I think there's so one I do want to clarify sort of like blank search because I know that a lot of people have different definitions of that and take that into different
Yeah,
ways
yeah. The
because
terminology from the beginning.
yeah, going back to terminology. So what I mean by necessarily a blank search doesn't mean that we need to do an entire training day of finding nothing and that's a blank, or that we have to do an hour necessarily of a blank. A blank could just be, we go through a series of rooms
Mhm.
and five of them are blank and one of
Yeah.
them is a target. Or maybe we do two training exercises, for example, where there's a set of five rooms and then another set of five rooms. And in the first five rooms are all blank, or the
Mhm.
second five rooms are all blank, and the
Yeah.
target is random, and one target is randomly embedded there. So that is introducing blanks. So that's something that
Yeah.
a lot of times we do, but a lot of times people think of it as, if I have five rooms, I have five targets out.
Mhm.
So anyway, so I don't necessarily think we have to have a full day of blank searches. Like blanks can be discrete blanks that introduce to build that ratio of how much search to finding a target.
Mhm.
Now the question is well, what about potentially using other odors to
Yeah.
help build some of that search persistence? And there was a study that DSTL did in collaboration with Auburn where they used arbitrary odors like vanilla as kind
Yeah.
of these vigilance odors, where, say, for example, I know that I'm going to be operational for an hour and I want my dog to have one operational find, but I
Mhm.
can't put an operational odor out. So I'll put vanilla out. And
Yeah.
that seemed to maintain performance really, really well. But I think your question was something separate
Yeah.
was could I build an extended search behavior with, say, a toy, which I know might generate more search behavior, and would that transfer over to a detection task? And now that I've talked for like 5 minutes, the answer is I have no idea. It's an interesting
Yeah.
question. And you know,
Yeah. Because,
your
like,
anecdotal evidence is probably as strong as there. I don't think there's been
mm,
research on that topic, but I
mm,
think there's really interesting questions is how much generalization will you get from training exercises, maybe with the
yeah.
toy, versus training exercises with other things, or like the what is called sort of the UDC or the neutral odor here. How many training exercises with that odor would transfer to operational
Yeah.
environments? All interesting questions that I don't think has
Yeah.
been well researched.
So, like, cause yeah, like for me, the question is if I like our trainer dogs are trained in different branches, and they're generalists. They're no specialists. They're
Mm-hmm.
not perfect in any of these branches, but they're quite good at some of them. So we're doing search and rescue where they do nose work. We're sometimes just letting them search for toys because this is how we get them like hard on environments. They gain expectancy to find at specific places, and we're never wasting indication behavior because they can just grab the toy and return to the handler. And then we're doing detection work where, similar to search and rescue, they have to show a specific indication behavior. So that was our question: does this make sense, and can the dog um, yeah learn from the different branches to
Right.
think like, okay, yeah, I've also back then I searched for a human, but I didn't find any in like 30 minutes, and then 31 minutes I finally got something in my nose. So maybe today in scent detection in this building it might be might be similar. It's like this this hope experiment with the rats that were drowning, and then they were saved, and then they thought like, well, it's just continue swimming, you know.
Mm.
So
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I think I don't think I don't have the research to say yes or no, but definitely something that we might think about doing a study on.
yeah, and it's interesting that you put like you talked about this study with the vanilla odor. I
Hmm.
think there is. Are you referring to a recent one, or like I know of a quite old Israeli study where they put out also some odors like this, and like what I have thought, and really I have no scientific background. I just come from the practical side and want to learn to understand why practical things are working.
Hmm.
So from my point of view, the performance in these studies might has elevated or didn't drop that fast as if dogs didn't find anything else.
Hmm.
But and please correct me if I'm wrong or um, give me a new idea. I or we tell our handlers in deployment not to hide anything on like of their own training orders or real target orders in a building, because sometimes we have these days where we really find nothing, like you're searching 30 apartments and you're
Hmm.
finding nothing.
Yep.
And what expectancy or what idea are we planting in our dogs' minds if they suddenly find in a place where they have never been before a familiar odor that obviously is from our case with
Hmm.
target orders or training orders. So I think that if I did something like that in operation, I will teach my dog, okay, if it's hard, I pretend searching until I find something familiar. And
Hmm.
I think as a handler, as a trainer, I might risk training my dog to search for familiar odors, like familiar from my handler or from the training group, rather than searching for targets out there that
Hmm.
they haven't been exposed to before.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. So that study I think was done in 2012, and if I remember correctly, because I wasn't involved in that study at all.
Oh.
Um, I believe it was a 5-week time frame.
Mm.
So, and they were
Was
all
this on the paths or different paths where they buried hides?
no, that was the Israeli group. This one was a follow up study that was done shortly,
Okay,
probably like
interesting.
1 or 2 years after.
Yeah.
Um, and they did essentially uh, three groups where the dogs either were searching and didn't find any targets. The dogs were searching and they found a random target, and the dogs were searching and found their target at some frequency, like one every 3 searches or something like that. And I think they were all familiar search environments. I don't think they tested it in novel environments.
Yeah.
And what they showed is that the dogs that had an arbitrary odor performed just as well as the dogs that had a real target odor. And the dogs that didn't have any target odors dropped off in their search
Yeah.
checking in typical decrement. And that was over like a 5-week period of time. So one criticism is, well, what happens over a lifetime of, arbitrary odor, as you say? That answer is still out. Like, will that
Mm.
potentially produce non-desirable effects that might occur, um, you know, l- later on, versus, in those novel environments? I'm not sure. I think maybe if the odors that you choose are, I think kind of what you might be getting at, are very different in terms of search strategy needed than the target. So one thing I definitely see is, like, for example, C4 is a
Hmm.
very easy odor for dogs. The
Yeah.
type of search behavior they need, that they just need to do a couple of, and they can just say it's in that room. Like they can just head up direct towards
Yeah.
that. That's very different than TNT. You need
Yeah.
a very detailed type of search behavior. So if you build something where if I'm not finding my target, I can just head up source a really easy odor from a different direction, then you might be training a type of search behavior that is undesirable for an operational environment where you don't know how concealed your odor is, or whether it's double bagged or put into a pipe that only has one little odor source coming out of it.
Mhm.
So I could see that being a potential effect, definitely.
And also, I think we don't know in these studies how did they treat dogs with no findings. Like we used to somewhere in between recall a dog and reward or not, like reward or just send them back to search. So just to give them feedback for wanted behavior, like for key behavior search.
Mm-hmm.
And like we don't know what they did in the studies. What we have realized in our real world was that there was a period of time where we really enforced handlers to here and there recall their dogs just to give them positive feedback for wanted behavior. Still, we're not knowing what they're doing, so we don't want to click them during the search. We don't
Mm-hmm.
want smelling and sniffing, etc. So we just add another behavior that they like and that they might associate a reward with it. And then we've realized, with some dogs at least, that the search behavior declined. And years later, I was reading the book Punished by Rewards, and I thought there might be. Do you know the book?
No, I don't know that book, but what you're describing is something that we've seen exactly too, and it depends on the dog. For some dogs, we don't see that. Some
Yeah,
dogs become very sensitive, and they learn that I just need to look like I'm doing something, and then I'll get something. And it
yeah,
depends on the frequency of targets. Because if
yeah,
your targets are very, very low, then it's easier for them to just look like I'm doing something and then get the reinforcer. If the targets are high, then it gives you a nice little balance, between whether I'm finding something or not finding something to minimize potential false alerts. But yeah, I don't know the book, but what you're describing is something that rings true to our
yeah. No,
experience.
the idea in the book or the thesis or I've forgotten the name of the author. He was a direct student of Skinner, and he's criticizing, like, is this English to say it like that? But he criticizes the behaviorist way of looking on things. So
Mhm.
because he says we like intrinsic motivated behavior will decrease when you add external rewards. And for something like I want to see a dog hunting for odor, and like for sure I have to train or teach them that we are not always getting prey like in nature, but I I thought that sometimes it's necessary to reward them for a search just with a recall and toy or recall and some kibble. But the more often I do it, the more I risk a decline of behavior because I I just I can't find the English term for it, but yeah, I'm not making it any worthy for them. It's
Mhm.
like making the behavior cheap. And
Yeah. That's actually the extrinsic, reinforcers for intrinsically motivated behavior is actually a really interesting sort of debate cycle in the academic literature because uh, there are lots of back and forth and actually a lot of debate where you can find evidence kind of going in both directions. Um, but yeah, no, there definitely do seem to be at least some situations in which you can potentially cheapen an intrinsically rewarded behavior to some degree
mm,
with external reinforcers. When that occurs or in what specific situations, um, there's still back and forth debate. I remember during my PhD, someone was actually looking at this for children in the classroom because a lot of times, in the class, you know, whether you if a child is doing some type of artistic thing,
mm,
and some of the debate is if you then add an extrinsic reinforcer to that, like, good job sticker kind of thing for that type of
exactly.
behavior,
Yeah.
you might, there's some evidence that sometimes you'll actually then see a decline of that behavior naturally. And then there are some studies that find that it's actually related to exactly how you provide that reinforcer. So there's back and forth debates on
Sure.
that, but that is a very interesting sort of construal of that I think would be testable. So that's definitely a really interesting question.
Yeah. I send you the cover of the book. It's written by Alfie Kohn. And
Yes. Now it's familiar. I haven't read it myself, but I know exactly what you're talking about now.
Maybe you find some time somewhere to go for it. I thought it's really interesting, and unfortunately, there is no German version of it, so it's kind of hard to work through it. But it's at least for me, and probably for some of the listeners or viewers, this might be very interesting. So Nathan, I don't want to steal too much of your time, so I would skip some of the many questions that I have prepared. But I'm totally happy with what we have went through. I just have three, four shorter questions now in the end, if you're fine with that.
Yep.
So, I think we've learned a ton already from detection and from your explanations. It was really interesting. I hope that we might find some time in the next month to do a part 2 of this, or maybe in a few months or years I can visit you. But for now, total different topic. What advice would you give to the 20-year-old Nathaniel Hall?
Ooh, I thought we cut out the personal questions at the beginning. So wasn't that one of the things you said we're not going to bother with on that? Yeah, good question. 20-year-old me. So 20-year-old me would have been. I was going to be a vet at 20 years old. I was studying to become a veterinarian, and that I changed directions because I was very interested in research, and I think that was definitely. I'm happy for that choice, although I think I would have had fun as a veterinarian, but I also saw the calling on it that this is kind of my steady hand, so it wasn't going to be great for like surgery or operation. But that's a good question. I think the advice that has helped me the most, or would have helped the most, is that I think when I got started, it was a very difficult industry or area to get started in. I probably spent many years chasing my tail because either, I was in graduate school, so I wasn't law enforcement. So a lot of times when I was reaching out and writing emails and saying like, "Hey, can I come and participate and join?" The answer was no. I think maybe I should have tried more places and tried more things, because I think when I got no's or rejections from a couple of points early on, I just took that as a representation of the industry rather than maybe a more localized kind of thing. And I think I probably got set back several years in terms of being able to figure out what the real industry problems were. And I think several things of studies that I did early on was just me like doing a blind guess at what could be related to the industry and could be solve some problems. And looking back on those, I don't think that they have really. Those initial papers probably have absolutely no impact right now, and are unrelated. They were just misguided. And because I think if I would have persisted earlier on trying to better connect to industry at that time, I would have saved some time. I did. There was some benefit to it because I did learn a lot of things the hard way. And sometimes learning things the hard way, you learn a lot more than just someone saying, "Here, do it this way." And then you just do it that way forever. Sometimes having to learn, like, I'm going to try this and that didn't work. I'm going to try this and that didn't work. I'm going to try this and that didn't work, does build a level of important experience, I think. So there was value to it, but I think there could have been a happy medium between what I went through and how it actually went.
Yeah, I get it. The next one would be what, like in all those years of research and also training dogs yourself, I guess, what was one of the biggest aha moments, like enlightening moments, maybe a result you really did not expect to take place?
Those do happen quite frequently. I'd say of recent memory, the biggest aha one that we had is we were doing a study on human scent uh, sort of recognition. So, what is it about human scent that dogs seem to be keying into and paying
Mhm.
attention to? And, there's the scent rafts theory for tracking, trailing.
Okay,
And we started a project that was looking at what part of sort of the skin or scent raft seemed to be important for dogs finding human scent or live people. And we set up an experiment, and the dogs were not responding to any skin related things that we could provide to them. And
really?
then we did a variety of tests. And we did this weird test where we put someone in, was breathing in through a snorkel into like a little chamber and then sucking that air out and then presenting that. And the dogs hit that right away. They showed a really
That's so
strong response.
interesting. Wow.
And so we were like, because at that point we were like, is it hair? We were cutting our hair off. We were
Yeah.
like scrubbing things as much as we could, and we just were not reproducing a human scent. But then breath, all of a sudden, got a really strong response. And we've done, we did a couple of a series of experiments in that study, and we've been following up with some studies on search and rescue dogs right now.
Mhm.
And breath seems to be important. And that was something that I would not
That's
have guessed. I didn't think about. And, but it left the impression that, we need to test everything because some
yeah,
things that we just know as true have never really been thoroughly tested.
yeah,
So sometimes testing those things that we know are true
yeah,
can sometimes lead to really interesting results.
yeah. And it's really, really cool that you tell this story, because I have a similar one, and this was years ago, probably 10 years ago or even longer. And we were at a search and rescue, urban search and rescue training, the big rubble pile from the Austrian army.
Mm-hmm.
And we had some hiding places in the basement, no lights at all. But down there it was very dust, not dust, but what's like it's very dry, and you have some sand in the basement. So
Like
is it
musty.
dust? Yeah, never mind. But there was a lot of dirt in the air, so
Uh-huh.
breathing was hard. So I put on a mask, an ordinary FFP2 mask, like we all
Mm-hmm.
know. Well, back then no one knew it, unless you were working at the hospital. But I used one of these masks to be able to breathe down there in the
Mm-hmm.
basement. And I can't recall how many dogs, but eight out of 10 dogs did not find us.
How
And
interesting.
I
Yeah.
told this story, like in the past years. I told this story always, again and again and again, and like this fits what you described. I think in search and rescue, the yeah, the breathing air, carbon dioxide, is it that way, called that way in
Carbon
English?
dioxide. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is one of the main components that our dogs are going for. Like, I'm not a trekking or trailing guy. I'm really like a wilderness or avalanche or rubble guy. So off leash searching, and these dogs, like the really advanced ones, did find us, and it was
Mm-hmm.
crazy because like in the basement we have no lights, but we were not simulating that we were um, out of reach, so the dogs could even touch us. But that wasn't what they went for. They were
Mm.
going for breathing air, and that was breathtaking. Actually, it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Well, I'm
Very
glad that
interesting.
that research sort of matches up to your experience. But yeah, no, we were like dumbfounded by it at first, and then, but yeah, that was definitely another aha moment for us.
Pretty cool. So we're almost at the end. Last but not least, in my previous episode, I had a colleague and friend coming over from France. His name is Bastien Marché, and this was episode 93. And I always ask my guests to give me a question for my next guest, not knowing who it will be. So
Okay.
his question was, not knowing that I would interview you today, do you think a dog needs a job to be happy, or can street dog or shelter dogs also live happy lives by simply being free without a task that humans gave them?
Yes, I think street dogs can be pretty happy with their sort of natural style lives without necessarily needing a job per se. I think uh, some dogs reinforcers are going to vary, and I think a lot of our working breeds can be highly reinforced by interacting with people. But a lot of one thing that we miss a lot of times is whenever we're thinking of dogs, we're thinking of the small purpose-bred population of dogs around us, which actually only makes up, I think it's like 3% of the world's dogs. A
Mhm.
vast majority of dogs in the world are just living free ranging. And we a lot of
Yeah.
times forget that that's actually what dogs are, because that's very different than our pet population. So given how successful free ranging dogs are, I think that they are happy. But I think for some of the dogs that we have bred for, that human interaction, that high toy reinforcer, those dogs probably do need that worker interaction for that sort of
Mm.
life satisfaction, if you will.
Okay. Great answer. So, what's your question for my next guest?
Good question. Let's go with, because you can't even tell me who they are, but I'm going to guess
I
they
don't even
might.
know yet, depending on
You don't even know
who's
yet.
first.
Nobody knows. I'm going to go for something that would be what. When was a time in which something that you thought should work didn't work, and how did you fix it? And I'm thinking probably could be training related, but if they can't think of a time, maybe they're the best trainer in the world, and they never had anything go wrong.
I doubt it. Yeah.
They can think of another opportunity, but I find that, kind of like that breath study, it's those times when you're like scratching your head so hard trying to understand what's happening. That's when you like really make the biggest leaps when you get through it.
Mm.
So that's my question.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to share, or is there any announcement that might be interesting?
Oh, I didn't think of any announcements. We do, I guess, now that you're giving me that spot, the conference that we have here in the United States, the Joint Symposium for Working Canines,
Mm-hmm.
have a website. We just hosted our first one in April, which was a success. So we are going to commit to a 2027 conference in the United States. So if you want another potential conference that's going to be a combination of handlers, scientists, and both,
Mm-hmm.
keep an eye out. JSW Canine is the website. There's a podcast associated with it too, if you're interested in that.
Definitely.
But yeah, the purpose of that is to try and combine, the practice and the science in kind of like what we're trying to do right here, back and forth, and figure out, have more of these conversations in an open forum.
Nice. Can you send me the link to the website, etc.?
Yep, definitely can do that.
Yes. So I will add this to the show notes. And now to everyone watching and listening, I am sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Nathan, thank you very much. This was a great 90 minutes around, even more. Oh, wow. 1 hour, 50 minutes. Yeah. Again, thank you. And nothing more to say. Like, share, subscribe, everyone. Let us know what you think about this episode with Dr. Hall, and see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you so much for having me. You can see the comments before you invite me back again, but if you decide to, I'm more than happy to.
We will talk again later. Thank you so much.
All right, you have a good day. Thanks.